Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or the guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's September the 4th, and we have a lot to talk about. A couple of weeks ago, MS Research Australia released a really interesting report titled Health Economic Impact of Multiple Sclerosis in Australia 2017. The report is a detailed snapshot of some of the economic realities of living with MS, from employment to quality of life issues. And the report makes some important recommendations for future consideration. Well, we're going to be considering that report with my guest today, Dr. Lisa Melton, Head of Research for MS Research Australia. But before we get to my conversation with Dr. Melton, there are a few other things that you should know about. There's some good news to talk about today for people living with progressive MS. The results of a phase 2 clinical trial for the drug Ibutylast indicate that the drug decreased the progression of brain atrophy or shrinkage in progressive MS by nearly 50%. And the hope is that this dramatic slowing of brain atrophy will translate into the slowing of progression in physical disability, which is going to be tracked in a future phase 3 clinical trial. This was a 2-year study that followed 255 MS patients across 28 different sites. It was funded by the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, the National Multiple Sclerosis Society, and Medici Nova, the manufacturer of Ibutylast. And what's really interesting about Ibutylast is that it's been an approved medication to treat asthma and stroke in Japan since 1989. Right now, it's also being studied in the United States to treat ALS and drug addiction. Ibutylast has been given fast-track status by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, and the successful completion of this Phase 2 clinical trial sets the stage for Phase 3 testing. Last year, the very first medication to treat progressive MS was approved when Ocrevus received its FDA approval. And it appears that Ibutylast may be added to what's going to be a growing list of approved treatments for progressive MS, and it just gives me enormous pleasure to share that news. Ibutylast is likely going to be added to what will become a growing list of approved treatments for progressive MS. Those are words that people living with progressive MS have been waiting a very long time to hear, and I'll be including a link to the published study in today's show notes. And while we're talking about newly approved treatments, Genentech, the manufacturer of the drug Ocrevus, is offering a couple of free educational webinars. In one webinar, you'll hear from an expert about Ocrevus as a treatment for primary progressive MS, and the other webinar will focus on Ocrevus as a treatment for relapsing remitting MS. The drug has been approved for treating both primary progressive and relapsing remitting MS in the U.S. and other countries. The webinar focusing on primary progressive MS is going to take place on Wednesday, September 12th, and the webinar focusing on Ocrevus as a treatment for relapsing remitting MS is scheduled for Tuesday, September 18th. To find out more about these upcoming webinars or to register, visit ocrevus.com/events, and I'll include a link to that webpage in today's show notes. There continues to be increasing interest in the potential benefit of cannabis-based treatments for multiple sclerosis. Previous studies have shown that cannabidiol, or CBD, the non-psychoactive component of marijuana, can improve spasticity and mitigate pain for MS patients. So last week, MMJ International filed 2 applications with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration requesting permission to begin clinical trials testing its pharmaceutical-grade cannabis-based medications as treatment options for MS and Huntington's disease. At the same time, MMJ International also requested a meeting with FDA officials to discuss next steps in the development process for an investigational new drug. So it's good to see progress being made in putting cannabis-based treatment through the rigor and transparency of scientific study. I know this is a subject that a lot of you have expressed real interest in, so you can be sure that we'll be following these developments. Well, another week has gone by, and unfortunately that means that there's been another wrinkle in the healthcare debate here in the United States. A new bill has been introduced, but the danger in this bill is a little bit harder to see because it's been crafted to be deliberately deceiving. And this political gamesmanship makes the bill even more dangerous to people living with MS or any pre-existing medical condition because it's a healthcare wolf that's been dressed in sheep's clothing. Last week, Senators Cassidy, Graham, and Heller, the same senators who drafted last year's failed repeal of the Affordable Care Act, introduced a new healthcare bill. But to fully appreciate how deceptive and dangerous this bill is, you need to understand a little bit of context as well. Right now, there's a case pending in federal court that can potentially invalidate the Affordable Care Act and eliminate the protections provided by the Affordable Care Act for people with pre-existing medical conditions. And if you're living with MS, I don't have to tell you how devastating this could be. Well, the Justice Department has weighed in on this case in support of eliminating these protections for people living with pre-existing medical conditions. That's why the National MS Society has joined forces with the American Cancer Society, the American Diabetes Association, the American Heart Association, and the American Lung Association in filing a friend of the court brief citing the devastating impact that millions of families would face should the court invalidate the Affordable Care Act and eliminate these patient protections. And I'll include a link to that legal brief in today's show notes. We've talked about that case before. Well, the pending litigation has set off an uproar demanding that Congress take action to protect the rights of people with pre-existing medical conditions so that they can continue to have access to affordable health insurance. And now, Senators Cassidy, Graham, and Heller, along with several other Republican senators, have introduced a bill that sounds as though it will do exactly that. In fact, the name of the proposed legislation is the Ensuring Coverage for Patients with Pre-Existing Conditions Act. But in truth, this bill would do exactly the opposite of that. This new bill requires insurance companies to offer health insurance to people with pre-existing medical conditions. And that sounds great, doesn't it? Well, stay with me now. Because while the bill requires that insurance companies make health insurance available to people with pre-existing medical conditions, it also allows the insurance companies to refuse to cover those specific pre-existing conditions. In other words, if you're living with MS, you'll be able to purchase health insurance coverage, but that insurance would cover anything except anything related to MS. If you're living with diabetes, you would still be able to purchase health insurance coverage, but that insurance would cover anything except anything related to diabetes. And if you're living with cancer, you would still be able to purchase health insurance coverage, but that health insurance coverage would cover anything except your cancer treatments. Pretty slick, don't you think? This is a bill that allows these politicians to truthfully proclaim, hey, we're sponsoring a bill in Congress that ensures that people with pre-existing medical conditions will continue to have access to health insurance. But no one is bothering to explain that this health insurance won't pay for anything related to those pre-existing conditions. Not even prescription medications. And given the cost of prescription medications for MS, I think you can see how catastrophic this legislation would be. The entire bill amounts to little more than an election year scam. It gives cover to politicians who don't want to have to face their constituents and explain why they're taking away their access to quality health care. And this kind of political trickery provides one more reason why you need to be informed about the issues that directly affect you when you cast your vote this November. I know this sounds so ridiculous that you may be wondering if it can even be true. The first time I heard about this bill, it sounded unbelievable to me. So I'll include a link to the bill itself in today's show notes in case you'd like to read it over and draw your own conclusions. And I just want to remind you once again that I don't consider healthcare to be a partisan issue. It's much more basic. It's much more fundamental than that. As families who are affected in so many different ways by MS, I believe that we should vote for the people who will vote for us. The people, no matter their party, who are going to represent our best interests. And I think those best interests are pretty easy to understand. We need to fund important research that can take us closer to a cure for MS. We need access to quality, affordable health care. We need access to quality, affordable health insurance. And we need access to affordable prescription medications. Well, you can be sure that we'll be talking about the importance of advocating on your own behalf as this year's midterm election approaches. This past week, MS Research Australia presented a really terrific program called Progress in MS Research Live Update 2018. The program featured Dr. Lisa Melton, the head of research at MS Research Australia, and coincidentally, my guest on today's podcast. It also featured Professor Michael Pender discussing the connection of the Epstein-Barr virus and MS. Professor Amit Bar-Or discussing inflammation and therapeutics for the brain. Dr. Jack Antel discussing the biology of progressive MS, and Professor Anne Laflamme discussing the immune system and progressive MS. More than 3,000 people watched the live stream of this program, and the really good news is that the video of this entire program is now available for online viewing, and you'll find a link to that video in today's show notes. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, my guest on the podcast today is Dr. Lisa Melton. Dr. Melton is the head of research at MS Research Australia, and I wanted to talk with Dr. Melton because just a couple of weeks ago, MS Research Australia released a really interesting report titled Health Economic Impact of Multiple Sclerosis in Australia 2017. The report provides a detailed snapshot of the economics behind MS, looking at employment, quality of life issues, and even calculating the cost per person living with MS in Australia. The report concludes with some powerful recommendations for next steps, and in just a moment, we'll be talking with my guest, Dr. Lisa Melton, about what this report is telling us, what it's recommending, and how we transition those recommendations into actionable steps. My guest is Dr. Lisa Melton, the head of research at MS Research Australia. And we're talking with Dr. Melton today because this past week, MS Research Australia issued a report prepared by the Menzies Health Economics Research Group titled Health Impact of Multiple Sclerosis in Australia in 2017. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Melton.
Thanks, John. Good to be with you.
Well, I'd like to dive right into this report. So I'll ask you, what are the elements or aspects of this report that immediately jumped out at you?
So this report, it covered three main areas, which was an updated prevalence estimate for MS in Australia, also the cost of living with MS in Australia to both people with MS and the community, and we also looked at a quality of life measure for people with MS, so the impact on people with MS and their loved ones. And so the three big things that sort of jumped out is one, that the number of people living with MS in Australia has gone up. So we're comparing this to a report done in 2010, and the number of people has gone up from just around 23,000 to now 25,600. And that's possibly due to people living longer with MS, so people are just living longer and living well with MS, but also possibly a slight increase in incidence, and more people are getting MS as well. The cost of MS has gone up. The total cost has gone up because people with MS, there are more people with MS, but also the costs have gone up slightly. And the biggest thing that jumped out for me when I looked at the results when the Menzies team delivered the report was that for the overall cost of MS, the proportion of the cost due to lost employment, back in 2010, this was 50% of the cost. And now that's actually dropped down to only 30% of the cost. So I think that's a really good sign that people with MS are living better, living well, and able to stay productive, stay in the workforce, and look after their families.
You know, I want to come back to that issue of employment in just a moment, but one of the things you mentioned was the change in prevalence since the last report that was done in 2010. And when I took a look at the prevalence of MS throughout Australia, I saw that there was really a wide geographic range going from a high of about 139 people with MS per 100,000 in Tasmania down to about 75 people living with MS per 100,000 in Queensland. Why do you suppose there's such a wide variance there?
Yeah, so this is what we call the latitude gradient in MS prevalence, and it's not just a phenomenon to Australia. It's actually a global picture that we see. So Australia is a big country. It's a continent. So and it covers a wide latitude range. So the top of Australia is much closer to the equator, and Tasmania, which is an island off the bottom of Australia, is really quite far away from the equator. So the incidence of MS globally follows that same pattern, that the number of people living near the equator, there's fewer people with MS, and then countries that are further away from the equator have a higher incidence of MS. And the strongest evidence we have is that this relates to the incidence of UV light. So UV light itself has an impact on the immune system, but also ultraviolet light on the skin helps us to synthesize vitamin D, which we know that low vitamin D is a risk factor for the development of MS.
Well, as you mentioned, this report talks about a few different things, certainly the cost per person for people living with MS, quality of life issues, and I just want everybody listening to us to know that I'm going to put a link to that report so people can download it and take a look at it for themselves. And there'll be a link as part of the show notes. The report also concludes with some really interesting recommendations, I thought. And I found its first recommendation to be really interesting. It says, and I'm quoting now, interventions to prevent people from developing MS are crucial to counteract the rising prevalence of MS in Australia. Well, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that I think every country in the world would appreciate an intervention to prevent people from developing MS. But when you put that out there, what do you really do with that recommendation? Where do we go with it?
Yeah, it's a really tough one, John, and people have been looking at it for a really long time. So we do have a lot of information about the risk factors for MS, and I mentioned one of them just there, which was vitamin D, and other risk factors are the Epstein-Barr virus. Adolescent obesity is one of the factors that's been picked up. Smoking is a really big factor in increasing the risk of MS. And there are genetic factors as well in the risk of MS, but we can't do anything about our genes, but we can think about ways to act on that other information that we have. And this is not something that Australia is going to be able to do alone, and it's not something that other countries are going to be able to do alone. So I think we really need a global push to look at ways that we can start reducing the incidence of MS. Smoking, the message about smoking is so important for so many different aspects of health, but it's a really big factor if we can really get that message out there. And then also look at other ways. So in Australia, we're conducting a clinical trial looking at vitamin D supplementation. It's what we call a secondary prevention trial. So it's people who have already had an episode that means they're possibly going to get MS, and we supplement those people with vitamin D to see if we can prevent or delay a diagnosis of definite MS. But we really need to look at primary prevention, so trying to see whether, but there are huge studies that would need to be done to see whether we can prevent MS using vitamin D or increasing UV light incidents, things like that. Really need a global approach, and certainly tackling the Epstein-Barr virus really needs a global approach for us to really make a difference here.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. You know, one of the other interesting recommendations that I read, and this kind of relates to the employment issue that you brought up a moment ago, was a continued focus on managing symptoms and supporting people with MS and their carers in employment. Well, I especially appreciated that this recommendation included supporting carers in their employment. Is this as tricky, or maybe the word is sticky situation in Australia as it is here in the United States?
I think so. I think it's a global phenomenon. People with MS, there's many reasons why they find it hard to continue working. They drop out of employment earlier than you'd expect based on physical disability, and we know that relates to things like fatigue and cognition and all those invisible symptoms of MS. And this data about employment, we've had the data about employment in Australia for many years now, and that's really focused the attention of the MS societies who care and support people with MS on that employment situation and giving them the support they need in the workplace, and really raising the awareness amongst employers about some of the really quite simple things that they can do to help people in the workplace. Make it, quite small accommodations. That's going to be different for every person depending on the symptoms, what impacts them most in the workplace. But so that's really been quite a big focus for us in the MS community in Australia, and it seems to be making a difference. So, that focus plus really effective medications is obviously making a difference because we've seen that big change over the last 7 or 8 years. But also, obviously for people who are caring for people with MS as well, that they have to change their employment situation in order to look after people with MS. So providing that support in the community so that everyone can stay productive and everyone can stay connected in their community, they stay socially connected, really makes a big difference to quality of life.
You're absolutely right. And I think it is a global issue, certainly faced in so many different countries, but all kind of relating to the same basic reason. And what's interesting to me about having an employer make an accommodation for someone who is on their staff and is living with MS is it's different than making an accommodation for so many other sorts of disabilities where the set of symptoms is always the same. And so an employer has a very clear and simple understanding of what sort of accommodation a particular person with a particular chronic illness might require. But when you get to MS, sometimes it could be vision. Sometimes it could be something having to do with the chair you're sitting in. Sometimes it can be so many different things depending on the particular set of symptoms that person is dealing with, as opposed to everybody with MS has the same thing. And if employers just do A, B, and C, they'll be well accommodated.
That's right. You're absolutely right, John. And I think that's where it's so important that people with MS are empowered to speak with their employers, and so that they can make it, they can work with their employer to say this is exactly the types of the supports I need, and that they might fluctuate over time. So you talked about that's different for every different person with MS, but of course we know that fluctuates for an individual over time. And that MS organisations, MS societies can help in that picture to provide information, to work with the person with MS, to support them in that conversation with the employer. And so I think it's going to need all of those elements to get employers to understand. And I think there's actually a study done a few years ago in Australia as well that looked at when people disclose their diagnosis of MS in the workplace. That obviously it's going to be different for everyone, and different employers are going to respond differently. But on average, people who disclose their MS diagnosis, in the workplace were more likely to stay in employment for longer. So that was a really interesting factor, and that people who asked for accommodations in the workplace almost always get them. And so I think that's the thing that many people with MS will worry about is, what will happen? Will I be discriminated against? Will it affect my chances of promotion? Will people look at me different? Will people treat me differently? But I think, the research is there to suggest that in many situations it's a good thing and that people will get the support they need. So I think it's just that thing of people don't understand what MS is, how it affects people. And so the more work we can do to raise awareness and educate employers about, what can be done to support employees, they're very committed, very, it makes such a big difference to quality of life as well as the financial stability of the family to stay in employment. So it's really important for everybody that we do as much as we can.
Well, now that this report's been released, what has to happen to start turning those recommendations into action steps?
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question, a big question. So in Australia, we're working hard on what we've put together is a roadmap to defeat MS, and that has several elements to it, much of which is about research, more research to make the difference in terms of people living with more advanced disease, with progressive types of MS, who really don't have many or any treatment options at the moment, to really stop MS from progressing and keep them in a physically and mentally fit situation so that they can contribute, so that they can work, so that their quality of life is better. And we're just not there yet. There's a huge build-up of momentum. We've come a long way with the research, but we really need a big push to tip that over into the clinical trials and the treatments that those people really need. And the other elements are really about ensuring that people get access to effective treatments as early as possible in their disease course, because we know that makes a long-term difference in terms of disability outcomes. And really, the big thing is about the research to stop the MS and to reverse the effects of MS. And so we're working as hard as we can to increase the funds available for researchers, and we're also obviously working with our global partners in other MS organisations to do that, because there's some of these areas of research that it's not possible for just one country to do on their own. So as we talked about before in terms of prevention and so on. So that's a really important thing that we're doing with the International Progressive MS Alliance and through the MS International Federation, trying to all work together, pushing in the same direction.
Well, I talk about it frequently, and I know my listeners are heartily behind the idea of making this a global effort, because together it seems we can accomplish so much more quickly. So I appreciate your perspective on that. I think it is it's a great roadmap. We're all anxious to follow it. So hopefully we'll be seeing those steps move us all forward and closer to getting more answers and better solutions. Dr. Melton, thank you so much for spending a few minutes talking with me today.
Thanks so much, John.
That's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. If you haven't yet subscribed to the podcast, I invite you to do so. You can find Real Talk MS wherever you find the best podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, the new Google Podcasts app, and if you have an Amazon Echo or Echo Dot at home, you can just say, Alexa, play the Real Talk MS podcast. My name is John Strum. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time.